Hey everybody, this is Joseph S. Samaniego. I'm the author of the Carolingian Genealogy series. I am also a historian, and my history expertise, or at least what I really love to research and study, is medieval history, the Middle Ages. And that's one thing we're going to be talking about today with the history inspired fantasy, because we've seen it in fantasy quite a bit, and that is the Wars of the Roses. Now, a lot of people will say War of the Roses, which is inaccurate because of the fact that there were multiple instances of separate conflicts. There were a few times of peace, but it was multiple instances of conflicts here. So it means there were multiple wars. Now, this was a civil war slash family feud. Basically, it was cousins fighting each other for the throne of England. And it was very similar in that concept to the anarchy that happened several hundred years prior with the same family. Well, sort of same family. So the Wars of the Roses was a fight between two cadet branches of the Plantagenet family. Plantagenet family, excuse me. Whereas the anarchy was the birth of the Plantagenet dynasty in England with Henry II's ascension to the throne after Stephen, which was the kind of the outcome of the anarchy. What Stephen made his heir as Henry II, who was his cousin. Well, the Wars of the Roses was Lancasters versus Yorks. Lancasters being from John of Gaunt, Yorks being from his brother's side of Edmund of Langley, I believe. And what you end up having at the end of that was these two cousins, two cousin families, branch cadet families, fighting each other for the kingdom. Because, well, long story short, Edward III died with Richard II as his heir. His first choice of heir would have been Richard II's father, Edward the Black Prince, who died a year prior. Richard II was not a good king. He was really young when he became king, and that threw the whole family into turmoil, the country in turmoil, and people like his uncles, John of Gaunt and his uncle Lionel, they wanted their they wanted their claim. So what you ended up having was people that were very powerful, controlled more land and more armies than the king himself, basically trying to pressure the king. And they couldn't necessarily get the throne, but the next best thing was get their heir on their throne, get their sons on the throne, which did happen in various ways. So we're going to go in deeper into this, but first, let us talk more about the historical nature of the Wars of the Roses. Now, as I said, the idea behind the wars was it was a succession crisis. So Edward III of England, this guy up here, I know it's kind of going to be hard to see the names. Edward III of England here dies without an heir. Now, he had staked his claim on his mother's claim of France. So he had been fighting. The Hundred Years' War kind of took off with him in earnest. His son, Edward Black Prince, was a fearsome warrior, very famous, had fought in the Hundred Years' War, had gained a lot of ground, and was really looked at as being the quintessential heir. Edward III was a formidable king, famous warrior. He was definitely king of kings for the England. Edward the Black Prince was shaping up to be very much like his father. He dies of dysentery during the Hundred Years' War. Very common in siege camps, very common in the Middle Ages for warfare for camps. It wasn't a hygienic place. And his son, Richard II, here becomes king. So he dies. Within a year, he dies, and he becomes king. And that's when it gets really upsetting for a lot of people. Lionel Plantagenet. Now, these are all Plantagenets. Lionel Plantagenet is not happy because, the way the succession worked is it worked here, but they don't want to listen to him. None of these guys do. So Lionel Plantagenet is thought of as the next in line, more or less. However, what ends up happening is excuse me, what ends up happening is he only has a daughter, Philippa, and she married into the Mortimer family, and they had a son, Roger. So Roger Mortimer basically becomes the heir, and that's a very famous line, the Mortimer line, and they're going to come up a lot through the Wars of the Roses. And the other aspect of this is Edward III had given his sons. This is for the first time in history that you really see this happen for the English. Is he gave his sons all these dukedoms, and so it kind of boiled into they became more powerful through those dukedoms and through those land grants and armies and taxes. They became more powerful than the king, more wealthy, more powerful. So John of Gaunt here, John Plantagenet, he marries into the Lancaster family. He's also actually probably the most powerful, most richest man in England during his lifetime. Probably also one of the most aggressive. He was known for being kind of hot headed. He was known for being very skilled, not only as a leader on battle, but actually as a diplomatic leader as well. In his holdings and he was definitely he would probably made a pretty good king as far as just being strong as a person. Well, he actually at one point was also a disputed king of Castile from his marriage, and he had several marriages. The ones that really focus on today is here with Catherine, who was I think his mistress, and Blanche. Now, with Blanche, he had Henry IV, and Henry IV came and deposed Richard II, excuse me. Now, that's important because now you have a usurper on the throne. And that obviously didn't sit well with the Mortimers. It didn't sit well with the other sibling, Edmund. Now, Edmund is the one who started the York line, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, Henry IV had Henry V, who was famous. He defeated the French at Agincourt. He Band of Brothers speech. Shakespeare immortalized him more than he would have already been. He just dies at around 25, 26 years old. So he dies young. Again, I think it was dysentery, but he dies young and has a very young king or very young heir, Henry VI. Henry VI goes through spells throughout his lifetime of mentally unwell. There are times when all he can do is function at the bare minimum of breathing, and that's really it. And so his wife, Margaret of Anjou, I think here the Valois family. So yeah, I mean she was part of the French nobility as well, but of the Anjous, which the Plantagenets are from the Anjou line as well, with Geoffrey. She is a very strong, capable woman, just like her mother. And really, what she tries to do is tries to run the country herself. And some of the nobles are okay with that, most are not. And that's where a lot of this starts kicking up, is they see that Henry VI is not fit. He's not fit to be the king. He's unwell. He comes and goes mentally, and what you really start to see is a breakdown of his support. But she still has support. His wife still has support, but she doesn't have an heir. She doesn't have a child, a son. So what ends up happening is Richard of York, Edmund Langley's son, has a son, also Richard. He is a very prominent, strong man. He is very, again, he with this line, you're kind of splitting it. You know, you're either really weak or you're really strong. There's really no gray area from these guys. And Richard of York is strong. He's formidable. He's strong. He wants to be the Lord Protector. He has a claim to the throne. It's better, really, in a way than a couple of others, but it's not the true claim, or it's not the true claim. But neither is Henry VI because he's from a usurper line. So his claim is decent. Now, one of Margaret's major supporters is Somerset, the Duke of Somerset, who's Beaufort, from the Beaufort line, which is from John of Gaunt. And he is actually John of Gaunt's grandson, whereas Richard of York is John of Gaunt, or Edmund's grandson. So they're both grandsons to the princes of Edward III. So they both have a very strong legitimate claim. Now, Richard of York settles for his son, Edward, to become heir. And that was almost as good as you could get a lot of times, because it would push too much turmoil in there, especially if you have already been given the Lord Protectorship, which basically just means that when the king is unable to fulfill his duties, you're kind of like the king, or you're able to speak for the king. And even when the king is there, you're able to you're his number one advisor. It wasn't always given to the right person. Somerset had it at one point, and he was blamed and used as a scapegoat for losing a lot of the territories in France in the later part of the 100 Years' War. Whether that should be blamed on him or not is a whole nother topic. The 100 Years' War is a whole nother topic. But what you end up seeing is the succession crisis. So you have two cousins who are basically vying for the king's attention at this point. And it all comes to a head at the Battle of St. Albans, where Somerset is killed, along with, I believe, one of his sons and several other nobles, such as, I think, Northumbria was killed, and I want to say maybe the Baron of Nottingham might have been killed. But that is a precedent-setting battle. High-ranking nobles were executed after the battle without trials. So it wasn't like this, oh, you're battling for treason. You're being tried for treason. That had happened before. This was nobles being killed after the battle without a trial and without really cause other than the fact that they're rivals. And that was something that was very precedent-setting at this point. Had it happened before? Yes, of course. Had it happened so blatantly? I don't believe so. Now, the idea was typically if you were a high-ranking noble, you would be captured and ransomed. And that would actually pay for your enemy's campaigns. But that wasn't happening here. York was getting rid of a rival, and it did come back to bite him very famously later on. So, but what you have is the two cadet branches. Lancaster started by John of Gaunt, and York started by Edmund. Basically, these are two cadet branches of the Plantagenets, who decide that they want to vie for the king's attention. Like I said, at this point, they're just trying to become either the next in line or the number one guy for the king. They're not really trying to become heir, or not be trying to become king themselves. That was for their sons to do. And we know that Henry VI did have a son, finally, with Margaret, and Richard of York had a son as well. So let's continue on with, how does this relate to our fantasy? So, excuse me, as I said, the Game of Thrones really showcased a lot of the Wars of the Roses parallels. What you have is a succession crisis. Robert Baratheon, and I've been using my mouse to point things out. I realized that you can't see that, so just try to watch there. Robert Baratheon, who is there in kind of in the center, with the crown on, had 3 children legitimately, and many more illegitimate. So what you end up having is these 3 children are in line for the throne. It's discovered that they're illegitimate. So now here's the crisis. Joffrey is not the true king, even though he has been recognized as the king, as the king's heir. And we're going to get into that in a minute. Recognition, legitimacy, things like that. He is not the true king. Really. He's not supposed to be. Now, he is made king. He is recognized as king. And that is really what at the end of the day is what matters. He is plagued by rebellions. Stannis, the king's next in line brother, and then his younger brother, who really has no business rebelling because he wouldn't even be the next king, are fighting for control. Robb Stark breaks away and forms his own kingdom. Totally separate. And then actually Greyjoy does the same thing. So what ends up happening is Stannis and Renly are fighting to become king. not fighting for heirs, fighting to become king, because they're saying, hey, this kid is illegitimate. He's not the true king. Get rid of him. Joffrey dies, leaving no heir. So his next in line is his younger brother. That's how the succession works. Your king dies, goes to the oldest son. Boom. If there is no oldest son, it goes to the next oldest sibling who is a male. This is when we're doing the male primogeniture. It goes to the next oldest male sibling. Or if you're doing equal primogeniture, or not primogeniture, but just the equal ship, it goes to the next sibling, the next oldest. And that could even be an uncle if there are no siblings left. It goes to the next oldest rightful heir of the previous king, or even previous king before the king. And we see that a lot. You actually see that a lot in the Russian line. That happened quite a bit. And it actually also happened a lot in the, I want to say, in the Carolingian line and the Merovingian line as well. Although Merovingian was very different because they did the Confederate partition, which is very stupid in my opinion, but it creates a lot more wars. So anyway, put your comments in below if you think I'm wrong. So what ends up happening is a succession crisis, and a lot of people don't realize that as a usurper, Robert Baratheon wasn't the true heir either, or couldn't really name the true heirs either. Here we talk about more anarchy style stuff. So in the anarchy, what happened was Henry I dies after his heir dies on White Ship. It was a ship that sank in the English Channel. It was covered in Pillars of the Earth series, and very, very kind of well historical fiction, but kind of accurate in a lot of good ways. What ends up happening is Henry I names his daughter Matilda. A lot of people called her Empress Matilda because she had been married at one point to the Holy Roman Emperor, and at this point she doesn't have any. She has an heir, but she's married to Geoffrey of Anjou, Geoffrey Plantagenet, which is it deals with the flower, type of flower. It's a yellow flower, if I'm not mistaken. And she has a son, Henry. And so he names Matilda as the next queen. I don't think she has Henry at this point. So when he names Matilda as his heir to be queen, and gets all the nobles to swear to it, they do, and then they back out once he dies. That was very common as well. So Stephen, being a grandson of, I want to say grandson, he might have been a great grandson of William the Conqueror. Now you got to remember, Henry's from the same line. They're from the same lines, but Stephen's from a daughter line, so matrilineal line, much like Henry II will be. He's from a matrilineal line of William the Conqueror, and he's a count in France, I think in Rouen, and he takes over the throne because they welcome him. The barons want him to take over the throne. The earls want him to take over the throne. He has an older brother that could have actually done it, but then they pay him off and he accepts it. And so Stephen becomes king. Actually, he was Stephen of Blois. I forgive you guys to forgive me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Blois. So Matilda is saying, no, you guys swore to me. And several nobles back her up. And what ends up happening after years of war, Stephen agrees through a lot of, because it's shown that he's losing support. He's losing a lot. He agrees to a compromise. And that compromise is Margaret's son Henry. Again, he's from the same line, but he's matrilineal at this point, becomes his heir. And so Henry became Henry II. So that's how you end it. So how does that relate to here? That would actually be here. So pointing it, Rhaegar Targaryen, who dies after having his marriage annulled and remarried to Lyanna Stark, has Jon Snow, or who we know as a Targaryen. So he's not a Snow. And so now he's the heir to the throne, technically. He would actually be now the technical heir to the throne. But then with the usurper line of Robert, you have Gendry. Now, could there be more? Sure. And Gendry is created or recreated the, I guess they would be considered Duke. He made Baratheon by, by Daenerys. Well, and I guess that could be Duke, Count. I don't know. They really never say how they do it. But so he's now, I guess, in what would be really recognized, Jon would be the king, and Gendry would be his heir until Jon has a son. Or, Game of Thrones established you could have queen, so has a child, so it could be a daughter too. Now that's cool and all, and that's a little bit of how the anarchy and Wars of the Roses influenced a little bit of the Game of Thrones timeline as far as the what you see here. Let's go this way over on the family tree, because a lot of what happened was cousins fighting, because as you can see, there's a lot of connections, not as many as in the English line. So now let me go into something else, fantasy related, something with my own work. So what I'm showing here this is from a book I'm working on right now. I'm almost done. It's starting the editing process. It's called Scorned, and it actually details the succession war called the Stag War. And what ends up happening is a illegitimate daughter of the king. So in Far Off Kingdom and Court of Dreams and Shadows, I've established that Charles is the king. He starts being king. Very first page of Far Off Kingdom, he's being recognized by his lords. And here, the way I do it is barons, manor lords, then the gentry, and then you have your regular unlanded knights. So he goes to war, and you find out in Court of Dreams and Shadows that at some point he has a daughter with a tavern worker who is from the Dwarven kingdoms, or Dwarven kingdom in this part of the world. There's can't have fantasy without Dwarven kingdoms. He has an illegitimate daughter, and a merchant brings her after the mother dies, and he recognizes her. Key point: recognizes. He does not legitimize her. And at this point, there's never been an established heir who was female. All this is 200 years after the formation of this kingdom, and all the heirs have been male, and that comes into play a little bit. But the difference between recognizing and legitimizing is when you have a child out of wedlock in this time period is called being a bastard child. A legitimized bastard. An illegitimate bastard is just someone you don't recognize, you don't acknowledge, whatever. Usually they just do, no, we don't know what really happens to them a lot of times. If they're recognized, typically what will happen is the king or the lord of the realm, whoever had the child, the father, will recognize them, and they'll get some perks of being recognized. Will they get the titles? No. But the king could, or others could, whoever holds the land could grant them various boons or money allowances, things like that. A lot of times they'll end up being part of the king or part of the lord's entourage, maybe serving in his military, things like that. They'll be a leader, and they'll be known for being, oh, that's his son, but he doesn't recognize him. Or that's his daughter, especially if it was a daughter, because then they could be used for diplomatic purposes, especially like alliances and marriages for business purposes or alliance purposes. When they're when they're legitimized, now they can inherit certain properties. Would they come before a crown prince or princess, even if they're older? No, probably not, unless that was his only son. What you would actually have is they would be able to take over dukedoms. They would get a duchy, and so you would have your crown prince, Charles, and then it would be Duke of, Somerset type of thing, which they were a legitimized branch. And a lot of times a recognized bastard can create their own dynasty apart from the family dynasty, whereas a legitimized will keep the family dynasty, or they could create a cadet branch. So there is a difference. There's a very big political difference between legitimized and recognized. So what you have here is you have the seal at the top, seal of the chancellor, the Lord Chancellor, who is recognizing the vote count. And this is very important because the crown prince, or the golden stag, is the heir. His older sister, older by about a year or so, is Rowena, and they call it black stag. Her father gave her that sigil, that image, that emblem. So she is the black stag because the stag is the family emblem, which is there at the big arms at the bottom. And what this is the top line are the barons, the middle, the second and third line on the golden side, and the second line on the black side is the manor lords, the manor houses, and then the smaller ones are all the gentry. And there's a lot more than this, but these are the main ones that we focus on in the story. And they took a vote. And so this is very similar to the whole Shakespearean idea of the people in the, in fact, I'll pull that up in a second, of people in the rose garden picking white or red roses. You know, you had the red rose for Lancaster, the white rose for York. And that was very, very symbolic. Shakespeare used it. It didn't happen in real life that we know of, but it was very symbolic because it kind of was like this whole idea of we're voting, we're taking sides. And that's what this was. This was a clandestine meeting the king did not know about, where his nobles basically chose sides. And for the most part, they went down what we would consider party lines. You know, the manor lords that answered to the barons voted for what the barons voted for. And then most of the gentry voted for their manor lord, with some exceptions. So let's see that image that Shakespeare did. So what we have here is the image I was talking about of the rose garden, and this was definitely in my mind as I was writing the tally scene, the voting, where they're picking red roses for Lannister, for those supporting Lannister, and the white roses for York. And that's kind of where I was going with. Now, that is probably not what happened. And you have some guys back there looking, I guess, probably maybe taking a vote. I don't know. But we pretty much know that this probably didn't happen. This was more of a Shakespeare thing from one of his mini plays that dealt with this particular part of the family. In fact, this is from Henry VI, Part 1. But this was, he did several plays having to do with Henry V, Henry VI, and I think even Edward IV he did play on too. So yeah, definitely. In fact, the movie The King on Netflix, which is about Henry V, sort of. It's Henry V, but it's based on Shakespeare's Henry V. So it's not actually historical, but it's pretty cool. Anyway, so check it out if you haven't yet. And I did a review on it on my blog, so I'll link that in the post here. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap it up here, and we're going to talk about a little bit. Just this kind of was just an intro to the Wars of the Roses. It's a big topic, just like I said. The 100 Years' War could be its own topic. Anarchy could really be its own topic. A few of the other topics that really had a lot to do with the 100 Years' War could be their own topics. This is the beginning of the 100 Years' War. What we have at this point, I ended it more or less at the Battle of St. Albans. Not much longer after St. Albans. I can't remember when. But the Richard of York was killed. Very famously, they ambushed him, and then it was a battle. He was killed, and they put a paper crown on his head before. I want to say they drawed and quartered him. I could be wrong. They may not have drawed and quartered him, but they did kill him. They at the Battle of Wakefield, where if you're kind of keeping track here, he was I don't even know really. So if you're keeping track, then sorry. But he was killed much in the same fashion, without a trial, without any kind of diplomacy given to his noble stature. And again, he's not a prince, but he's basically on level with a prince. And so he was killed without any sort of honors given to him. No ransom, no nothing. They gave him a paper crown to mock him, and so he died. His son Edward, who was the Earl of March at this point, which is very important because the Earl of March is a March lord, and I talk about this actually in my books. Is the lord, the kind of the noblemen on the borderlines of the kingdom who are protecting your kingdom. So they're very important. Usually they're your number one or number two guys. Especially in this time period when you have Wales as being kind of, you're trying to subjugate them and they're not wanting to be subjugated. So here you are, your March Lord is should be your strongest guy. And here it is Edward the Fourth, who in his own right was a pretty good military leader. He made some very, very questionable choices, some very personal, emotion-based choices that resonated. But he was militarily a pretty good guy, but he also had a lot of good guys around him, such as Warwick, who was known as the Kingmaker. And that all came to a head at the Battle of Towton, and which was, I think, an engagement between about 60,000 people and 60,000 soldiers, and about 30,000 of them died. So it was the bloodiest battle on English soil. And that was really the first true Yorkist victory after St. Albans. And you could almost say the St. Albans wasn't really a victory because of the implications it ended up having. It was a victory, tactically it was a victory. Long term, it really could have been handled better. But the Battle of Towton was the first true major victory since St. Albans, and that established Edward the Fourth as the king. So with that, we're going to end there. We'll talk later about more, and I hope you enjoyed this. And come join me in my tavern again soon.